Okay, hi. Now it's time to talk about Hegel and his philosophy of right. So let's talk about the preface very briefly. Now, the preface to the philosophy of right, and the book was published in 1820, and is one of the few publications, official publications, that Hegel actually did. Right? He published his Phenomenology of Spirit. He published the Science of Logic in two volumes, right? And then he published his philosophy of right, and his whole system would be composed of three large parts, actually, with what you read for last week, the phenomenology of spirit, as a kind of introduction. And those parts are logic. So logic would be the theory of thinking, right? How one ought to think about reality. He developed an entirely new logic called the dialectical logic. We can talk about that a bit. He then has a philosophy of nature, in which he takes up the results of the modern science, his time. He organizes his reflections about modern science in accordance with his logical method. That's what he does there. And then there's a philosophy of spirit, those three things: logic, nature, and spirit. And in his philosophy of spirit, what he's interested in, what he does quite rigorously and methodologically, is study the various ways in which human self-consciousness and ultimately spirit, as a kind of collective, interactive, mutually recognitive medium within which, or structure is a better way of putting it, actually, a mutually recognitive structure. I'll explain that vocabulary more fully in a sec. Mutually recognitive structure is self-organized in accordance with his logic. Okay, so before I get to some of the technical details, I want to talk about the preface a bit. We can't go through it in detail, but for all intents and purposes, we can reduce our commentary of the preface to this little motto here, so to speak. What is rational is real. Is double it. What is rational and real, and what is real is rational. What comes to mind when you hear that? What is rational is real. So if something's rational, then it's real, right? But what is real is rational. Doesn't this sound like conservatism? Whatever exists, that's fine. You know, whatever it is, it's rational. Okay, so this has been read as a kind of endorsement of conservatism. Don't change anything. Now, when you read the rest of the book and you study history, you realize that what Hegel is recommending in his book departs quite radically from the virtually medieval constitutional form of the state of Prussia, within which Hegel himself was an active philosopher, right? So whatever this means here, right? The way Hegel understood it has to be compatible, unless he's someone who's not concerned with consistency, which of course he is. This has to be made compatible with the rest of the book. Okay, so the word real here actually translates a Greek term, not a Greek term, ultimately a Greek term actually, but a German term, Wirklichkeit. The Greek term would be energia. You're familiar with that from Aristotle. Hegel was a big fan of Aristotle. He even fancied himself to be a kind of modern Aristotelian. So what is rational is wirklich, is actual. Okay, so what's actual for Hegel has a peculiar definition. If something is actual, it contains two ingredients. Okay, one is that it exists. Well, that's easy to grant. If something's actual, it has to exist. But the second ingredient is that it accords with a certain kind of logic. It fulfills a certain kind of logical structure, right? It has content, but the content has assumed a certain kind of rational form, right? So to say that what is rational is real is to say that what is rational, okay, unites with existence in some way. That's not difficult to grant if you read this in a kind of weak way, that some rational ways of organizing human existence and some rational ways of human beings organizing their lives, okay, those things become real. You follow? I mean, it's not like reason has no foothold in the world. What is rational is real. Okay, very good. He didn't say that everything rational is real. He didn't say that. But that's where rationality actualizes itself in the world. so that you end up with this this conjunction of reason and existence. Reason bodies itself forth in existence, and that's a comment for him on the actual structure of history. History itself is a kind of progressive unfolding of reason. He has a kind of rationalistic providence. He thinks he can make out the structure of providence, correct? Whereas Christians think you can't make out the structure completely. You can make out some of it, certainly, for Christians. And there are a lot of theological commentaries which purport to do exactly that. As a matter of fact, I can show you something I have right here. But anyway, look at the second part of the doublet. And what is real, okay, what is actual in the sense of both rational and existent. That's rational. Well, that is simply to state something that's by definition true. You follow me? Okay. So this is not very dangerous. I mean, he's not a conservative. Now, why would he say something that sounds so conservative? Because at the time there was a conservative backlash against the liberalism of the period. Now, you know what the Republican Party in the United States represents today. In the early 19th century, when this was published, right? In the early 19th century, that was considered radical. That was considered radical. You know, the idea of careers open to talents. That, you know, if you're an aristocrat, you're not automatically given, you know, a comfortable or reputable or honorable position in the army or something. That you know, the commoners should have fair access to positions in government and in the army and so on and so forth, right? That the state should keep out of trade and not set prices. That mercantilism is a bad idea, right? Those things. That perhaps people should have a right to speak and criticize their government and contact their governors and hold them accountable in periodic elections, things of that sort, right? That was all radical back then. And that was new stuff. Okay, so I mean, the U.S. only got set up in '87, Bill of Rights in '89. The French Revolution tried to accomplish something rather different than that, but they tried to set up a new radical social and political experiment, and that failed, obviously. So Hegel is proposing something in this book, which is a kind of nuanced liberalism. I would call it a first moderate negation of American-style liberalism, actually. First moderate negation of American-style liberalism. He thinks that our system of checks and balances is irrational. You know, the founders of this country, of the United States, they meant for the government to be inefficient. They deliberately divided up its powers so that, you know, if the executive wanted to rush forward and accomplish something great, well, the legislative branch could check him by not passing into law what he wants them to pass into law. You know, originally he wasn't even allowed to propose laws, guys. We forget that. And if it turns out that any legislation that gets through, it might not pass muster relative to the standard of the Constitution, the judiciary branch can always strike it down. So our government is meant to be inefficient. People always wonder, why can't we get anything done here? We're not meant to get much done, okay? And we're just not meant to get that much done here. So we have one government agency after another, and we have about 30,000 federal employees. It's gone up by 10,000 since the 80s. And one wonders what in the world they're doing, you know, sometimes. So you can talk to your political science teacher about the efficiency of the federal government and efficiency of state governments and so on and so forth. It gets even more complicated here because we're a federal system. Right? So, yeah, Hegel, he negates. He negates the American liberal system, which is based on the thought of two thinkers, particularly John Locke, okay, and Michel de Montesquieu. So Locke is John. You can spell that, I'm sure. Locke is L-O-C-K-E, John Locke, right? And Montesquieu is M-O-N-T-E-S-Q-U-I-E-U. Okay, Q-U-I-E-U. That's the hard part. Montesquieu. All right, and then of course taught that the American Revolution was simply a transposition of the English rights of man to our continent and setting those up on a Republican foundation, right? As the U.S. outlaws aristocracy in its Constitution. So you take the English rights of man, you add a dash of John Locke and his effective doctrine of natural rights. He doesn't actually talk about them, but everything he says implies them, right? And so that was taken to be the effect of his doctrine in the second treatise on government, which you have to read. And then Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws is an important book. It's a neglected book. Montesquieu is mentioned more often in the Federalist Papers, by the way, which is the founding document of political philosophy for this country. You have to read that too. It's an amazing book. Okay, the second thing he says here is that it's not the business of a philosopher to teach existing rulers what ought to exist, right? That sounds like conservatism too. But you have to kind of dig into Hegel. You go over to the science of logic. There are three parts to his system: logic, nature, and spirit. Right? Spirit is the domain of freedom. Nature is the domain of necessity. Logic is the domain of both, of freedom and necessity, both at once. So if you turn to the logic and if you read through it, you find that there is a little section in there that is dedicated to the concept of what ought to be. Interesting. So you would think that, okay, Hegel knows his own philosophy, right? So if he's going to say that it doesn't belong to the business of a philosopher to tell existing rulers what ought to be, what he means is based on his definition, the concept of what ought to be, as laid out in the science of logic. And what does he say there? He says, this idea of what ought to be, this is a peculiarly modern notion. It has a very definite meaning. It refers to an ideal which is unrealizable. It refers to effectively an unrealizable utopia, right? Something that cannot be actually set up. So when he says that it's not the business of a philosopher to teach a ruler, how to realize what ought to be, what he means is it's not the business of a philosopher to teach a ruler how to achieve the impossible. Well, that's not much of a statement. I mean, it's not my business to teach people how to achieve the impossible because no one can do that. So it's actually nobody's business to teach anyone how to achieve the impossible because that can't be done. It's not even God's business, right? Assuming that God can't teach people how to make 2 + 2 = 5. It can't be done. So of course, it's not the business of the philosopher to teach people, to teach rulers what is impossible. So it's not the business of the philosopher to teach rulers what ought to be, given that what ought to be as a mere target, as a mere kind of goal that's ever receding over the horizon is impossible. You never reach it. Okay. So one more comment on that. Why even have such a concept? Because it provides people with orientation. Follow? You can aim at utopia without getting there. Be careful. As you aim at utopia, while you're walking towards utopia, you might fall into a ditch, right? It's quite possible that the steps necessary to even approximate to the impossible. I say, well, it's impossible, I can approximate to it. It might be the case that the steps necessary to approximate to the impossible will lead to your destruction and the destruction of everyone around you. It's possible too. All right. So much for the preface. Skip. Oh, by the way, he says, we're here, guys. In the modern world, here is the rose, here dance, right? Or leap. Some of the saltus leap. Here is the time to rejoice. It means modern institutions have achieved the end result of world history. Now, some of you are going to say, come on, we have, this was written in the 19th century. Since then, we've had 2 gigantic world wars. We've had several genocides, right? We live effectively in a propaganda state now. Have for a long time, only now it's come out into the open. At least half the world or a third of the world is living in abject poverty. They call them the bottom 2 billion. About a third, a little bit less than a third, are living in abject poverty. We're still dealing with worldwide human trafficking, the destruction of the environment, and we all live under to this day that we don't talk about it any longer, the continuous specter of total nuclear annihilation. That can still happen. Right? You want to jump about that, right? Okay. So Hegel wasn't aware of those later outcomes. And, there are sophisticated Hegelians today, and he's a very popular thinker, guys. There's a dedicated minority pursue Hegel and try to defend him. I used to be one of them. Used to. I think he's a very interesting figure, and he gives you all sorts of conceptual tools and ways of thinking about things. That's why I continue to teach him. But you can find people who are still defending Hegel, despite that list of stuff I just gave you there. And that's not entirely arbitrary, because I mean, his system, it's so supple. It's almost irrefutable. Now that itself can be a fault, right? That itself can be a fault. If you can't refute something, that means it's not something you can really evaluate, right? If it's something you can't demonstrate to be false, then how can you demonstrate it to be true? There has to be some set of criteria whereby you can evaluate it. So I'm going to try to evaluate it, okay? I'm going to try to evaluate it. And I'm not going to accept for myself or anyone else, I'm the only guy talking here, any kind of fancy footwork, trying to get around, the demands of what would count as a convincing rational argument. So why don't we comment on some of this? The philosophic science of right has as its object the idea of right, the conception of right and the realization of that conception. So what does he mean? So what is a right to begin with? What is a right? I can recommend something for you. If you want to, now, you think you have rights. I agree that you do, right? There are all sorts of people out there who are skeptics and relativists and nihilists of various stripe, and they maintain that rights are a fiction. This sentiment goes back to the writings of Jeremy Bentham, who I mentioned earlier in the course in connection with utilitarianism. He said rights are nonsense on stilts, right? Correct? Nonsense on stilts. Hegel disagrees. Rights are not nonsense on stilts. As a matter of fact, they're substantive, and they belong to the very substance of modern subjectivity. Remember that return to self through another, in which you enact your conception of yourself as a bearer of certain rights and duties. No surprise then that he's concerned with this concept of right. Okay? Now, he understands the concept of right to be correlative, C-O-R-R-E-L-A-T-I-V-E, C-O-R-R-E-L-A-T-I-V-E. Okay, guys, take notes. The concept of right is core, because I can't both write stuff on this board here and have this text. I want to talk about the text. So it's a correlative of the concept of duty. So the philosophy of right is straight away at once the philosophy of duties. Okay. Now in the subtitle to the philosophy of right, he refers to natural law. Okay, so now we are connecting. He's deliberately connecting his ethical philosophy and political philosophy, because both at once, and legal philosophy. All of these are going to occur in the same book. And it's a philosophy of agency. It's quite a number of things. He's going to connect his ethical, political, legal, and philosophy of agency back to St. Thomas Aquinas, right? Of natural law, and in a way to Thomas Hobbes. So what he'll do is, through the book, he's going to get us to the point where we're going to acknowledge that there are certain essential aims or ends of human existence. All right? And these aims or ends of human existence will then provide us with a ground for identifying the basic rules of conduct we ought to adhere to. And those are not going to surprise us. Those are going to be basically the second table of the Decalogue. Okay? He doesn't put it that way, but that's what it always comes down to. Or if you like, chapter 15 of Hobbes' Leviathan. I mean, we can dispute the details, but it's always the basic thing. We have to uphold the golden rule. We have to respect property and keep our word when we sign a contract. Okay? Physical assault is strictly out, of course. Don't perjure your neighbor. Of course, he'll maintain fidelity in marriage. And I think you can get a pro-life position out of his philosophy of marriage, only relative to marriage, interestingly. A pro-life position for married couples, that married couples can't. It would be contradictory, actually, for a married couple to abort a child. Okay? Because the whole point and purpose of marriage is unify, and unity between man and wife in a child. Okay? So, yeah, we'll leave it at that. We have recognized same-sex unions in the U.S. since 2015. That would be a non-starter for Hegel. That would be a non-starter because you can't procreate a child in a same-sex union. And of course, the response is, well, through through the cooperation of a third party that can be done, right? So, okay, we'll leave that to one side for the moment. So we're going to look at this idea of right, and that means the idea of duty as well, okay? But the idea of rights can be prior here. It's going to be prior to the idea of duty. That's interesting. So why is it prior? Well, your right is going to be articulated as a certain kind of self-consciousness. A self-consciousness of the right one can exercise relative to nature. And that's what he's going to call personality. And the right one exercises relative to one's own will. That is, in determining the basic norms and values. Okay, that structure and obligate one's activity of willing. Right? So we want to recognize your rights over mere nature and things. We want to recognize your right to be a self-determining agent who can think about basic moral principles, basically norms and values. And you have a right to reflect on them and determine them to be true or false, and then to act on them. Right? And then we want to think about your relationship to institutions in which you are embedded, or institutions of which you are a member. Right? That's a third level, isn't it? You relate to things. Things are distinct from you. There's a kind of external relationship there. There's a relationship to your own will and the basic principles which structure your. It's a kind of self-relation, not outside of yourself. Relation to yourself. I just heard some noise. With me? Okay, I'm being spied on. And there is a relation you have to institutions of which you're, through those institutions, you have a relation to other people. We're also members of those institutions. He has 3 institutions in mind, guys. Okay, write this down. Family, civil society, and state. Family, civil society, and state. Okay. Family is the medium of love. State, civil society is the medium of economic competition. Family, but also of the legal structure, which makes economic competition possible. Right. You need laws in order for that really to unfold. And then the professional bodies that we enter into. For example, if you were to join the American Psychological Association, if you became a professional psychologist, or the I don't even know what their name is, but the National Association of Attorneys. Their association may have a different name. I don't even know what it is. Okay, so that would also belong to civil society, and the state. That is the medium of solidarity, right? That's the place where you enter into a relationship of patriotic solidarity with your fellow citizens. So for him, the state is not essentially an instrument of violence or coercion, which it is for John Locke, all right, which it is effectively for Montesquieu, which it is for a whole series of modern thinkers. Max Weber, these great sociologists, basically of the early 20th century, defined the state as that institution, right, which maintains a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a certain definite territory, right? So the state of France is the one agency that can use violence on its citizens, in the case of somebody breaking a law within the territory of France. Okay, that's his idea. So Hegel recognizes that the state uses violence. He's saying that's not the essence of the state. Violence is not the essence of a state. The essence of a state is, if you like, patriotism. Okay, the organic unity and cohesion of its citizenry, a shared way of life, to which each can devote himself. With this, he thinks he's resuscitated an ancient notion of polity. Going back to Aristotle, but also particularly Plato. You guys read a little bit of the Republic. He's thinking of the Republic, actually. Okay, so much for part 1 here. We're going to analyze this notion of right, and therefore the correlative notion of. So he says the science of right is a part of philosophy. What part of philosophy would it be, guys? Would it be in logic, nature, or spirit? Which one? Spirit, right? It's a part of that domain of self-organizing rational activity, okay, or the self-organizing activity of a free being. And he thinks freedom reaches all the way down. Even the way you sense is free. We've already seen this. The way you desire is free. What's the natural object of desire? Satisfaction. And what is satisfying? Whatever you take to be satisfying. This is why there are people who, find satisfaction in all sorts of wild things, right? There are, fetishes. They used to call those perversions, right? Maybe they still do. Fetishes. You can desire anything. One can desire anything. So satisfaction is kind of a placeholder in the kind of opening up a glimmer of the actuality of human freedom that then becomes developed once human beings enter into reflective relationships. We saw how that happened last time, right? One guy beats up a second guy, and the second guy says, okay, I'll be your slave. And that second guy develops moral self-consciousness because now he's conscious that he's obligated to do something to obey the first guy. He develops the ability to delay gratification, so he cultivates virtue, right? And he develops that virtue. He develops character, unlike the master, which is interesting. The master doesn't even get what he wants. The master wants to be recognized, but he dismisses the recognition of the slave, or he recognizes the slave, and in doing that, he grants the slave has a right which limits the master's right vis-a-vis the slave. And so he does not get the recognition of his absolute right. It's actually impossible to have an absolute right recognized. It's contradictory. That doesn't work. So now is a good time to say that the philosophy of right departs from the assumption of mutual recognition. Mutual recognition. Do you get that? Both parties recognize one another. So when Al and Bartholomew, those are the names we used last week, I can't remember. When Al recognizes the humanity of Bartholomew, that means he takes Bartholomew to be an object of respect and concern, and that means he assigns to or acknowledges that Bartholomew has rights, basic rights. A basic right to life, that's where you begin, right? If you don't have that, then you have nothing. And Bartholomew, in turn, recognizes Al's right to life, those other rights, rights to property and things of that sort. So a certain packet of rights, whatever they are. You can negotiate what those are, but there has to be minimally mutual recognition of the right to life, correct? And Al knows that Bartholomew recognizes Al's rights, and Bartholomew knows that Al knows that Bartholomew recognizes his rights. And it goes in the opposite direction also. So this is a kind of intertwining of subjectivity. This is characteristic of human existence. Hegel's right about this, isn't he? I mean, this is, in fact, how we relate to one another. You know that I know that you own your computer. I know that you know that I know that you own your computer, and I know that you know that I know that you know that you own your computer. Okay? You keep going up those levels. After a while, it's pointless. But I think we go up about 4 levels. We can go up further levels if the situation calls for it. We do it all the time. It's instinctive. It's built into us. We're wired to do it, guys. Okay? It sounds a little bit confusing, but it's part and parcel of what it is to be human. Okay. So the science of right is a part of the philosophy. It's part of philosophy. The philosophy of spirit is the second part of the philosophy of spirit. Right? First part is philosophy of subjective spirit. That's basically the analysis of an individual human being and his various faculties. Now, interestingly, Hegel says he's not talking about faculties, but he's talking about various sorts of ways in which an individual returns to himself through another, like through sensation, then through desire, then through the emotions, and through rational thought, and through willing. There are various ways in which you return to yourself through your relationship to things that are distinct from yourself, things that you set as distinct from yourself, in opposition to yourself. Okay, so you can think about an avocado. Say, what is an avocado really? And you can study the organic chemistry of an avocado. You can do that. Or, what are the laws of Rhode Island? I live here. Maybe I should study them. You pick up the Rhode Island Constitution and you read it. Okay? These are things you can set opposite yourself and you return to yourself. That is, you're conscious of yourself in and through, and in virtue of your relationship to these things. That's what we talked about last week. Okay, so the philosophy of right is the philosophy of objective spirit. That is the second part. So you have philosophy of subjective spirit, philosophy of objective spirit, and then philosophy of absolute spirit. And then you turn to the philosophy of art. Hegel has a very beautiful aesthetics, I have to say. Philosophy of religion. His philosophy of religion is profound. I don't agree with it, but he's the guy was he was a genius. And then there is the philosophy of what comes after that? The philosophy of philosophy. He has a whole history of philosophy that gets worked out in the philosophy of philosophy. And then Once you complete that, he believes that the force of his system compels you to go back to logic. Then you would study logic again. And his system takes the form of a circle. Ideally, you'd start by studying the logic, because that would give you the methodology. Then you move on to the study of nature. Then you move on to the study of spirit. And you just return back to the logic, okay? You could continue around that circle. Now, he does give you an alternative way of thinking about this. I mean, you could conceivably start by studying nature, and then you could conceivably then make a transition to logic if you wanted, okay? And then go to spirit. You can start with spirit, and then conceivably go to nature, and then logic. But really, the ideal way of moving is from logic to nature to spirit. All right, and around a circle in that way. And someone might say, well, your whole argument is circular. He says that's good. An argument should be circular in the sense that it should loop back upon itself and reproduce its foundation. All right, and that way you avoid arbitrariness, he says. That means everything is proved. You want a circular argument. Nowadays we call that a fallacy, right? Because if you prove your conclusion by a premise, okay, then you prove that premise by the conclusion of a circular argument. Well, thanks. No, there's a peculiar way of doing this so that you don't fall into. All right. So the science of right is part of philosophy, as it must develop the idea, which is the reason of an object. Out of the translation is a bit rough. So that's good enough for us. In case you think I'm making stuff up. Philosophy forms a circle, okay? Right. It's self-enclosed. We can't, master Hegel in a short course like this, but we can make some progress. So let's move on to the next section here. Right is positive. Okay. Positive by positive means legal. First of all, in its form, since it has validity in a state. Okay, so that's our set of statutes. Established authority is the principle for the knowledge of right. So we're going to approach our concept of right via presupposing a certain knowledge of legal rights. Because legal rights are directly analogous to, if you like, ethical rights or moral rights. Those are two different levels, by the way. The way we think about right in legal philosophy. Let me put that more specifically. The way we, or somewhat differently, the way we think about right in law, okay, is directly analogous to how we think about right in the domain of ethics. Okay, so we can presuppose what we know about rights in law. So I can recommend. I was going to do this before I got diverted myself. Look up the article "Rights" in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Very nice treatment of okay. It'll help you since you assume you have rights. As I was taught for. It would be helpful to know what a right is. Okay, so there is this article called "Rights" in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So have a look at that. It's a very good article. So we have a positive side of right. Okay, so that has to do with the form. On the side of content, however, this right receives a positive element through the particular character of a nation. So what specific laws do we get? Well, laws differed in Russia as opposed to Britain at his time. Britain was very progressive legally for Hegel's time. Okay, the United States was extremely progressive for Hegel's time. So that would be the content, the actual laws that are on the books. Through necessity, the system of legalized right must contain the application of the universal conception of objects and cases whose qualities are given externally. Right? So you can have a what he's thinking of there is a common law tradition, right, where the law is determined through history and a history of cases like we have here in the U.S. Lawyers will tell you we have an idealized common law system here, but it's a common law system, idealized or not. Okay, and then there's an ultimate nature of decision. Our legislature, passes things into law, and that's that. By the way, when you turn to these notes, where do these notes come from? Let's make a little observation for you. These were taken down by his student Gans during his own, I think, significantly improvised explanations of his notes. So these things are not written, strictly speaking, by Hegel. They're written down by Gans, so they supposedly record what Hegel said. Now, is it possible for him to have made a mistake while he was writing stuff down? Yeah, so you have to take these notes with a grain of salt. Okay, let's move forward here. Yeah, I think this is a long section. Okay. There we are. My mad, I thought it just said. I see. Excuse me. I see how they organize this text. The note is something written by Hegel. The addition is not. Pardon me for misstating that. The note is written by Hegel, but the addition is added by Gans. So the territory of right is in general spiritual or spirit. Now he doesn't mean like a seance or something. He means the domain of free subjectivity, particularly insofar as it enters into various types of relationship of mutual recognition. Okay, so when two individuals recognize one another, the territory of right is in general spirit, let's say. Its more definite place and origin is the will, which is free. That freedom constitutes the substance and essential character of the will. And the system of right is the kingdom of actualized freedom. So later he'll say, well, it is the world of spirit which is produced out of itself and is a second nature. Second nature is a certain set of habits of willing, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about, the certain habits of willing which will make up sound ethical character. This sounds a little bit familiar. It sounds like Aristotle, right? You need good habits. So there's an Aristotelianism here, which we talk about something that's effectively like virtue. We'll change the vocabulary to rectitude, but we'll leave it at that. You know, there's a talk about something that looks like virtue here. And there is a talk about essential ends and aims of the human will, relative to can recognize what's necessary to achieve those aims. So there's a natural law element here. When we studied natural law, we learned that, natural law is actually an extension of virtue ethics. So it looks like Hegel is attempting to resuscitate, right, both a kind of virtue ethics in a modern period and the natural law extension of virtue ethics. He's doing it in a context in which we now talk about priority of individual rights. You get that? Now, he'll limit that later, but we're in a period in history in which we talk about the priority of rights. We talk about democracy. We talk about science and technology, correct? We talk about a free market. These are all characteristic features of the modern period. All right? He thinks he can develop a kind of virtue ethics and a kind of natural law theory within this modern context. So you think best of luck. Modern context was meant to negate all. Oh, you mentioned Adam and Eve there. Maybe you saw that. He thinks that he is posing a kind of alternative to classical Christianity. He presents himself as a Christian, but he's more like one of the heretic Christians. The Marcionites, the Montanists, the Gnostics, and others. Right? From the standpoint of Catholic, Lutherans are heretics. Lutherans just say the Catholics are wrong. Okay, they don't call them heretics. They say they're wrong, as would Calvinists, as would others. He presents himself as a kind of Christian, but as a matter of fact, he has innovates within the history of Christianity and proposes something that departs not merely from Catholicism but from Lutheranism. He says he's a Lutheran, but he's really not a Lutheran. You can't. It's impossible to defend that. So he says that Adam and Eve had to fall. Okay, that's not Christianity. Christianity says it's regrettable in some way that they fell. So, but he says they had to fall. There has to be a stage of suffering, as it were. Human beings have to fall. They have to work through their suffering. And by suffering, he means suffering. He says that history is a slaughter bench. History is a slaughter bench, right? We have to go through that stage of slaughter before we arrive at the place where you can jump for joy, because we've arrived. And I enumerated the reasons why we shouldn't be jumping for joy. The will contains first the element of pure indeterminateness. This is important. So what we have to have is a kind of what's called a doubling back of the eye and thought on itself. What does that mean? Think of this as reflective distance. I mean, in order for you to be free, you have to be able to distance yourself from your various possibilities. Okay, there are a couple of ways. I mean, a couple of levels here at least. First, you can decide what you're going to have for lunch. All right. But at a more profound level, you can decide who you want to marry. Okay. Maybe you have some different proposals coming your way that you're willing to make. And guys, don't go out there and propose to 4 women at once. just playing your odds, seeing who might say yes. You can stand back and make certain decisions about lunch or about a marriage partner or about a car you want to buy. But at a more profound level, you can make a basic decision concerning a life plan. That's what Hegel's really concerned with. You can choose a career, where you're going to live, who you're going to marry. Those are part of your life plan, right? So that's that pure element of pure indeterminateness. Call that in the contemporary philosophy, we call that reflective distance. So in this process, every limit or content present, though it be directly by way of nature, as want, appetite, or impulse, or given in any specific way, is dissolved. Right? Reflect on things, you hold your desire in check. You're able to delay gratification and even to cancel desires. I'm not going to act on that desire, right? And likewise, appetites or impulses. If an appetite is, like a sudden sort of desire, or impulse would be that, right? Impulse, a sudden desire that actually compels you to move. Okay, here we go. The limitless infinitude of absolute abstraction, or universality, the pure thought of it. Okay? And his note here makes include this. Those who treat thinking and willing as two peculiar and separate faculties, and look upon thought as detrimental to the will, especially the good will, show from the very start that they know nothing of the nature of willing. When you're willing, you're thinking, guys. Willing is a kind of thinking about what is good and what is right, and then translating that thought into reality. Okay? So let's leave it at that. That's all we need to know about that. Willing is a kind of thinking. Of course, thinking is a kind of willing. How can you think unless you're actually directing your thought through acts of will? Right? So thinking and will are less. They're two sides of one and the next. He says that in here. You gotta remember that. Okay. Another good point here. How free at this level of reflective distance? You can even distance yourself from your desire for life. Not you personally. Each person can do this. But a person can distance himself from desire to live. Take his own life. That's how free we can distance ourselves from our own desire to live, and fortunately people will do that and take their own life. Section 6. It is also the transition from the blank indefiniteness to the distinct and definite establishment of a definite content and object. It's a moment of choice. He calls it determination, right? So you go from reflective distance to making an actual choice, whether this content be given by nature or produced out of the conception of spirit. Okay, so it could be a desire that is imposed upon you by need, okay? Or you might conceive of something. You might think that, no, I'd rather fast today and spend the entire day listening to Miles Davis. Strange proposal, but let's say you want to do that. You fast the entire day and put on Miles Davis. Of course, his middle period. What else would you listen to, right? The classic quintet. Everyone agrees that's Miles at his height. Oh, rather, all jazz musicians agree that's Miles at his height. So through this establishment itself as a definite thing, the I becomes a reality. This is the absolute element of the finitude or specialization of the I. So by finitude, finis means limit. You make a choice, you limit yourself. You have to limit yourself, otherwise you are nothing. There are these people who think, okay, I'm going to be a poet, I'm going to be a player, I'm going to be an environmentalist, I'm going to be a scientist, I'm going to be this, I'm going to be that, I'm going to be that. You can't be all those things. You have to limit your choice. Or maybe you can be one of those things for 5 years, get really good at it, and then move on to something else. But you can't do all those things at once. You think, well, no, I'm going to work out my day. I'll spend an hour and a half on this or an hour and a half on that. I know from applying myself to stuff, it takes more than an hour and a half to be one of the top people at something, right? To enter into an elite. Okay? So to pick something, work at it like that. And then, of course, have avocations. You have, hobbies like that. Never. Okay? So, next point. The will is the unity of these two elements. So what if you make a choice? Like you identify with your career so much that, let's say, it's a pill that prevents the formation of any kind of cavities or gum disease or anything. Okay? So you go out of business. You get depressed and you go over to your sister's house and sleep on her couch and stay there, and you become dysfunctional. Hegel says what you need is the unity of reflective distance, okay, You need the unity of reflective distance and choice. So after you make a choice, you have to continue to enjoy a certain reflective distance related to what you've chosen. Now, what he means by that is not that you say, oh, I'm not going to take this seriously. No, he wants you to take it seriously. He wants you to realize there are other options. Okay, that's characteristic of modern subjectivity. I mean, if you're born into a tribe, even today, if you're born into a tribe, you're assigned a position and that's it. There is no alternative to the position. Okay? Sorry about that noise in the background there. I didn't realize that I was going to play so loudly. Children watching a ballet. So, yeah, if you're born into medieval Europe, or most societies historically, like 99% of them, you were assigned a position. That's the end of it. That's not characteristic of modern society. You can change careers, so to speak, right? So the will is the unity of these two moments. It is particularly turned back within itself, but back to universality. So you reflect on your particular choice as something that is one possibility alongside a field of possibilities. You take it seriously, you devote yourself to it, become an expert. But you could have done something else, and you could possibly change what you do, right? So that's good enough for that. I want to leave that for the moment. So those are the three levels you need to keep in mind: reflective distance. That was that third level, the unity of the two. You can call it reflective endorsement, because you're at that position. You have a choice you've made, and you've endorsed it. You haven't coalesced with your choice. Get perspective on it anyway. You continue and to endorse your choice. So I call that third level reflective endorsement. Reflective distance, choice, and reflective endorsement. If we define this particularizing further, we reach a distinction in the forms. Insofar as the definite character of the will consists in the formal opposition of the subjective to the object, expression of direct existence. I think you're confronting a world when you choose, right? We have the formal will as a self-conscious, which finds an outer world before. It's pretty straightforward. You look around, there's a world around you. You can choose to do various things. Two, and with that, the process by which individuality turns back in its definiteness into itself is the translation of the subject event through the intervention of an activity and a means into objectivity. Okay, so then your will involves a self-relation in which you determine yourself such that you then act. Okay, you're going to act so as to, he puts this logically, you'll negate what's around you. What's around you consists of a set of facts. It's a conjunction. It's this and that, and a third thing and a fourth thing. Like A, B, C, D, you can go on. You're going to change one or more of those facts. That's what choice involves, at least. Okay? And so D will become not D. You get replaced with something else. And that's your negation. You've negated D. Philosophers like to think logically. That's what we do. Okay? You can think about your situation in terms of logic. How do you do that? You treat it as a set of facts. How do you represent a fact? With a statement. My computer is on my desk. That's one statement. Fact. I'm sitting in my chair. It's a second fact. So what's my situation here, guys? What's the state of affairs? There's a computer on the desk, and I'm sitting in my chair, and there's a pen next to my computer, and there's a Lexar thumb disk plugged into my computer, and there are 3 light bulbs illuminating this room, and so on and so forth. I can keep adding to that. And through choice, I can change that state of affairs. I can subtract one of the elements, right? I can add an element. Okay. I can also change another thing. I can let the state of affairs rest. In my case, since I'm talking, right, if I choose to do nothing, then I've changed. I've actually changed the fact that I'm lecturing. I can stop lecturing. But what if I just walked in the room and sat down, and just sat there? I can just leave things be. You always have to choose either to do or not to do. That's basic. It goes back to Aristotle. Every philosopher acknowledges this. The basic sort of dyad of choice is to do or not to do, whatever it is. Okay. So whenever you choose to do something, you're rejecting. You're rejecting not doing it. And if you choose not to do something, you're rejecting doing it. There's always a yes and a no in choice. Do you get that? There's always a yes and a no in choice. So that comes from St. Augustine. He's very clear about that. I think St. Augustine is one of the great thinkers about freedom. In the absolute spirit, in which all definite character is thoroughly its own and true, consciousness is only one side, and the manifestation or appearance of the will, a phase which does not require detailed consideration here. What's absolute spirit? Absolute spirit, that's the third phase of spirit. Okay, you get kind of an anticipation of absolute spirit. You enter into life. That's family, civil society, and state. There you get absolute ends or essential ends, right? Aquinas would call them, well, we would call them following Aquinas basic goods. Basic goods, the essential ends of human existence. For Aquinas, those are simply given to you externally in virtue of the nature that you live in. He was through a created nature. He thinks he can demonstrate that. And Aristotle would say those ends, not Aristotle, Hegel will say that those ends are constituted through complex patterns of mutually recognitive relationship that take the form of institutions, family, civil society, and state. We'll get to there. Get there. Very sophisticated philosophy. I'll try to break it down for you. Hope I'm doing it. Now, insofar as the definite phases of will are its own peculiar property, whereas particularization turned back into itself, they are content. Okay, the will undergoes stages of maturity, guys. And each stage of maturity involves a grasp of certain norms. You know, the will, when it's right out of the womb, it's sort of like what we studied last week. It assumes an absolute right to all things. It assumes that whatever it's focused on is the absolute good, that it has to have that. It has an absolute right to that absolute good, and it assumes an absolute omnipotence. We have a desire. Have you noticed that? I just kind of tossed that out there. You're a little bit surprised by what I said. When a person desires something, there's a kind of built-in assumption of a capacity to satisfy the desire. Now, the desire itself is not reflected on, right? So if it's the desire of an infant or some human being in the woods who's never been civilized, the assumption of power is unchecked. Okay, now that's a very frustrating situation for an infant to find himself in, right? Because infants are virtually powerless. I mean, they're dependent on you for their very posture. You put them down in one position, they're stuck. So there are definite phases of the will. That comes along with acquiring virtues and the concept of norms and values, and you develop up. So this content is the content of the will, is for it by the virtue of the form given an end. Right? So we want that knowledge of values and rights and duties. You get that? I mean, knowing what your rights, duties, and what the essential values of life are, that itself is an achievement. That's a worthy thing to have. Even sitting in your chair and thinking about them, that's a worthy thing to do. Follow that? That distinguishes you as dignified beings. Okay, so this exists on the inner or subjective side as the imaginative will. But by the operation of the activity which converts the subjective into the objective, it is realized, completed end. Like I said, you sit in your chair thinking about these things. Okay. And then you're living out an end. Now, of course, you want to spend all your time just contemplating this stuff. We are doing that here, right? You want to spend some time doing ethical political philosophy, which is what we're doing. You want to spend some time doing that. And then, a small number of people will devote themselves to doing that full time, like me. And you can do that too. But not everyone can do that, right? Otherwise, our society will lack the differentiation of function necessary for it to continue. And it just works out. Most people are not interested in doing this. They want to do something else. They want to do sonograms or something, or they want to go into food, right? Agriculture, or something like that. So 10, the content or determinate phase of the will is in the first instance direct or immediate content, right? Talk about that. The will is free only in itself or for us. It is the will in its conceptions. This is the will that hasn't worked through its content. What's that direct immediate content? The desires that are given to you. I'll say it's your needs. It's your needs that, as it were, coerce your desire into assuming certain ends. You're free, right? You can always abandon those ends. You can fast. Persons can throw themselves out a window, sadly. Okay? So only when it has itself as an object is it also for itself. And freedom becomes realized. So his idea here is that what we need to do to be genuinely free, the will has to make itself an end of itself. That means you have to make freedom your end. Doesn't that make sense? We want to be free. We want to be free, right? How are you going to be free? You can only be free if you grasp. Here's the thing. You can only be free it's not by doing whatever you please. That's a kind of slavery for Hegel, and I think he got that right. Let's talk about this for a second. If you just do whatever you please, then you become a slave to your whim. Follow? What if you had an independent income? You could do whatever you want. You do some gaming, right? You eat whatever you want. Say, yeah, I want to talk to a friend. You call a friend. That's not freedom. That becomes being subject to one's whims. Being free is choosing a life plan in accordance with a true and justified conception of the good life. That's free, and that's freedom. You get that? Say it again. If you choose a life plan and then act out in that life plan, enact that life plan on the basis of a true conception, at least a justifiable, defensible conception of genuine values and norms, the ones that you should act on, conform your actions to. That's free. I mean, I stated it in two different ways, and luckily I recorded this. You can go back and listen to both formulations, but if you write them both down, you'll see that they relate to one another. Either they're equivalent or one implies the other. All right? Well, each implies the other. Well, that would be a kind of equivalence. Near enough. Okay, so much for 10 here. So that we have that immediate content, and there's the mediated content. I want to see if I want to talk about this. Okay. Well, that's fine. So, basically when you look at nature, you see nature, a lot of external relationships, a lot of mechanical relationships, right? When you turn to the domain of spirit, you find beings who begin to master themselves. They're self-conscious, right? So they develop these ethical habits and a conception of what is good and a conception of what is dutiful, what's right. And they build themselves up through relationships of mutual recognition in the spheres of family, civil society, and state, to the point of ethical individuality and ethical maturity. So hopefully this introduction has given you a shape, kind of sense and the shape of Hegelian philosophy. So the will, which is at first only implicitly free, is the direct or natural will. That's the will subject to your, what he says here, impulses, appetites, inclinations, right? The phases which the self-determining conception sets up in the will appear in the direct will as a directly present content. These things here. This content, with all its attendant phases, proceeds from the rationality of the will. It is therefore implicitly rational. Okay, I mean, the will is implicitly rational. The will is such that in order for it to become perfect, it has to adopt itself as an aim or end. So it belongs to the very concept, very important. It belongs to the very concept of the will, that it adopts itself as an aim or end. Otherwise, it can't be a perfect will. The will, in order to be perfect, it can't, as it were, adopt Mill's advice and subordinate itself to pleasure as an aim or an end. That would be to cut off the realization, the fullest realization of the will. Think about that. I mean, the will can be realized in stages. Obviously, it can be realized in stages, right? Through our progressive and a clearer, deeper, more nuanced grasp of values and of rights and duties. So that means that in order for the will to reach its fullest stage, we make that cultivation of the will itself the aim and end of the will. You might say, well, maybe that's compatible with the will making pleasure its supreme aim. And the answer is no, because if the will made pleasure its supreme aim, then it would be willing to sacrifice its own perfection for the sake of pleasure. You get that? That doesn't make any sense. The will has to set itself as an aim. You can't set something else as a higher aim than the will. It's impossible. Then it would justify being imperfect for the sake of pleasure, let's say. That's moral corruption. People do that, but that's corruption. That's moral corruption. One form of moral corruption. Other persons are willing to limit the realization of the will for the sake of money. Other persons are willing to limit the realization of the will for the sake of status. Other persons are willing to limit the state of the will for the sake of power, right? Or some combination of those. Usually all four. People have, they pick their flavor. There's usually one of those things they like best. So that's why we say it's implicitly rational. It has a kind inner logic. The will has to posit itself as its own aim, and it has to, in order to achieve its aim, learn certain objective values, rights. It has to do that. So the content is indeed for me my own, but the form and content are yet different. Okay, so you have this content that is not yet one with the form. How do you unite your form and content? Precisely by the will reaching its state of perfection. Now, that's my word. Perfection is a kind of medieval term. He's using a conception of perfection. You move through stages to a kind of perfection of structure. At that point, you don't merely have the form of the will. The form of the content become one. The form of the will becomes one with its content because it wills the content. Okay? And the will habitually wills the content. So form and content become one at that stage. I hope that's making sense to you guys. Let's move on. The system of this content as it occurs directly will exist only as a multitude or multiplicity of impulses. We're still at this early stage here. It's like my 4-year-old boy out there. Every one of which is mine in a general way along with others. It is at the same time universal and undetermined, having many objects and ways of satisfaction. Will, giving itself in this twofold indefiniteness, the form of individuality resolves, and only as resolving is actual. Okay? All right, so it's universal and undetermined. You have all these impulses, has many objects and many ways of satisfaction. There's that word satisfaction. He's thinking about his philosophy of desire. Okay, so you have this indeterminateness of objects and of satisfactions. And then you have to make a resolution on what to act on. Okay, so this is also fairly primitive at this point. By resolution, will fixes itself as the will of a definite individual and is thereby distinguishing itself from another. It's your will, your active will. Now you're distinct. So let's get rid of that. However, apart from this finite character which it has as consciousness, the immediate will is, in virtue of the distinction between its form and its content, formal. Okay? Because its content hasn't yet been worked up to an identity with form. So it's merely formal opposition now between form and content. They're relatively external to one another. It's not a thoroughgoing identity. Hence, its resolution as such is abstract. And its content is not yet the content in the work of freedom. We'll get there once the individual works up to objective values, rights, and duties. Okay. And also, all these things I skip here, right? These are worth reading. Matter of fact, it will be easier for you to read those. I know Hegel pretty, so I can just go to the meat. So the finite will, which has merely from the standpoint of form doubled back upon itself and has become the infinite and self-secluded I, stands above its content of different impulses and also above the several ways in which they are realized and satisfied. At the same time, as it is only formally infinite, it is confined to this very content as the decisive. What's formally infinite? Why infinite? The return to self through another, as you contemplate, your impulses and desires, you are conscious of yourself in contemplating those. Kind of internal return to the self through the other. You're related to your own states now. That's infinitive because you're not limited in any way. You return to yourself through another in a kind of quasi-circular fashion. And that circle, if you think about it, a circle is infinite. It's not limited. You keep going around it without reaching a term. You get that? So that's why that's infinite. At the same time, it is only formally infinite. It is confined to this very content as the decisive feature of its nature in external actuality, although it is undetermined and not confined to one content rather than another. As the return of the I into itself, such a will is only a possible will which may or may not be mine, and the I is only the possibility of deputing itself to this or that object. So it's all very formal and external. Hence, amongst these definite phases, which in this light are for I, the external will chooses. Okay, so this is external relationships. And the contingent, so your choice at this point, if there's no criterion for choice, it's contingent. It's like living by whim. We're living in accordance with external determination. All right. So what if one was raised irrationally? What if one was raised to be a racist? People like to use that example a lot. And then one just is a racist, right? That one's only one was raised to be a racist. Racism we can grant is irrational. Okay. That particular person is being dominated by an external factor. The fact he was raised up to be something, to adopt a certain of aims, keeping other persons out of power and instead in a state of lower status. But he's doing that on the basis of phantasm, basis of justifications. He has no justification for it. His will is being dominated and has been dominated. So it's a relatively immature will. Okay, that's why we think that racists are relatively immature. For some reason, people think that Donald Trump is a racist. That whole thing of barring Muslims from the country, I'd say, yeah, that was a little harsh. So I'm not going to defend him on that one. The freedom of the will is in this view of its caprice, in which we are contained, both a reflection, which is free and abstracted from everything, and a dependence upon the content or matter, either internally or externally provided, right? So what's internal content? What would that be? Well, maybe you just want to think about something in your imagination. That would be an internal content. External content could be a muffin, right, or an apple hanging from a tree, whatever. Since the content is in itself or implicitly necessary as an end, and in opposition to this reflection is a definite possibility. Caprice, when it is will, is in its nature contingent, and that reduces freedom to non-freedom. He says here, the usual idea of freedom is that of caprice. Most people think, oh, when I can do what I please, I work really hard, I can retire when I'm 40 and just travel. That'll empty you out. It'll make your life meaningless. I know it sounds good. I confess it sounds good. Trust me, I like traveling. On the idea of just traveling from country to country with no moral responsibility, pursuing your pleasure effectively, and that might sound attractive. Right? I'm real bohemian now. I'm exploring my consciousness. I'm developing my consciousness as a human. Hegel will say, no, you're destroying yourself. You're emptying yourself out. Aristotle and Aquinas would agree. Okay, maybe Hobbes can possibly make room for that, because that's be a kind of comfortable self-preservation. But the other guys, and anyone who has a positive ethical goal, Kant too, he would agree with this. Anyone who has a positive ethical goal would have to say that that's horrible. Maybe Mill would agree. If it's if traveling from place to place, pursuing finer pleasures, he might say that's okay. All right. I mean, Mill has a hard time justifying benefiting anyone at all, given that human beings for him don't have dignity. So yeah, I think maybe you could press Mill in that direction, but not Hegel, certainly not Hegel. So you don't want to reduce things to caprice, do slavery, ultimately slavery, caprice. So he spells all those out in detail. You can look at that. So hopefully you're enjoying Hegel. Maybe you understood him pretty well, and you didn't. Hopefully now we're working through him. If you did not, you are understanding him, because he places all these thoughts that make sense in connection with the modern doctrine of the will. You notice that Aristotle didn't talk about the will. Okay, Aquinas, but Aristotle didn't. So it helps to have this modern doctrine of the will. It helps to talk about this in connection with rights and duties, and eventually with capitalist institutions, and with some kind of respect for voting rights. Hegel limits those, but he recognizes them. And with science and technology, right? So we need to modernize all this stuff. These ideas of virtue and of natural law, they have to be worked up into a certain shape so they fit in our modern context. All right. So resolved upon and chosen, the will may again give up. Okay, you can always alienate yourself from a choice. I bought this slice of pizza, but I don't want to eat it. You take it, right? Even with the possibility of transcending any other content which it may substitute, and proceeding in this way, the will does not advance beyond finitude. He's making one choice after another, kind of like a mouse in what is that? That little thing that it jogs in, circular thing. Mouse in a wheel, right? So the opposite aspect, namely indeterminateness, irresolution, or action, is also one-sided. You make a whole series of choices, and you just get stuck at a certain level of moral development, really, or you can just sort of be irrelevant, even worse. Okay. So there's a contradiction involved in caprice. What's a contradiction to caprice? That the act of freedom is an act of being externally determined, by chance or by your upbringing or whatever it is, by some experience that shaped you when you were younger, you didn't ask for. Maybe it wasn't a good shaping, right? Okay, since the condition involved in caprice is the dialectic of the impulses and inclinations, it is manifested in their mutual antagonism. Okay, you can't act on all impulses at once, or one has to pick you, really. The satisfaction of one demands a subjection and sacrifice to the satisfaction of the others. Since an impulse is merely the simple tendency of its own essential nature and has no measure in itself, subject or sacrifice the satisfaction of any impulse is to subject or sacrifice the satisfaction of any impulse is a contingent decision of caprice, and that's that. Okay, so when do we finish that? All right, guys, an illustration here. I mean, what if you have a box in your chest? There's some dice in the box, and the dice were always bouncing. And whenever a certain number came up, that would determine what you did. Nothing to do with your will. Would that make you free? No, that would make your action a consequence of chance. You know, however that die came up, the dice came up, right? But acting on caprice is just like that. That's like when you act on caprice, which impulse is going to come up, and which number is going to come up. All right. So with regard to the moral estimate of impulses, dialectic appears in this form. Phases of the direct or natural will are immanent and positive and thus good. Okay, hence man is by nature good. This is a popular modern thought, sort of the modern doctrine. Man is born good. It's a negation of Christian doctrine, right? Christian doctrine, man is born with an inclination to sin, called original sin. For modern thinkers, man is born good, by nature good. You find modern thinkers who are also anti-Christian who maintain man is born bad. Right? Machiavelli and Hobbes. Get to Rousseau, man is born good. Certain liberal thinkers think man is born good. Okay? But natural characteristics, they are opposed to freedom and the conception of the spirit, and are hence negative, must be eradicated. Thus, man is by nature evil. Okay, so you can derive both conclusions from the same premise. So to decide for either view is a matter of subjective caprice, he says. Don't even bother. You're born neither good nor evil. You're just born with a fact. Okay? He says the Christian doctrine is that man is by nature evil is laughter, and the opposite, that he is naturally good. But you have to interpret it philosophically. Man's spirit is a free being who need not give way to impulse. In his direct and unformed condition, man is in a situation in which he ought not to be, and he must free himself. He claims this is the meaning of the doctrine of original sin. So we're born bad, so to speak. In the sense, we're born imperfect. Okay? We're born imperfect. It's not what Christianity teaches about original sin, but he takes Christianity, changes it. It's a free country, right? Free world. You can do what you like. That's what he's doing. Okay. In the demand that impulses must be purified is found the general idea that they must be freed from the form of direct subjection to nature from a content. That is subjective and contingent must be restored to their substantive essence. I mean, the will has to work. The truth contained in this indefinite demand is that impulses should be phases of a will in a rational system. So now what happens is the will now reflects on its contents. Now it begins to rank order them. The key here is prioritization. Which impulse and which aim of which impulse are you going to posit as most important, right? So that you're going to sacrifice others for its sake. And once you achieve that, what's going to come second, what third, what fourth, and so on, right? Now we set up a rational scheme of values in accordance with a rank ordering of priorities, okay? That makes sense. That's what you do. And if you do that, you're relatively more free. Now, people can set up those priorities in different ways, right? There's still some subjectivity. So Al has his prioritization or set of priorities, and Bartholomew has his set of prioritizations, right? And Calchas has his own set. It's a New Testament figure. His own set of prioritizations, right? And Donatus, he was later in the history of the Catholic Church. He has his own set of prioritizations. Which one do you pick? That was arbitrary too, right? Okay. You're not going to get to the full maturity of the will until the will adopts itself as an aim, and that is it makes its aim that of being a fully mature will that has an objective grasp on values, on duties, and on rights. You have to say, okay, great. So now I have to know what those objective values, duties, and rights are. But that's a trick to figure out what those are. Now, Hegel attempts to show what those are. I was going to say pull a rabbit out of a hat, but that's too strong. I mean, he'll attempt to demonstrate what those are in a section on ethical life. There we'll get that. So the reflection which is brought to bear upon impulses, placing them before itself, estimating them, comparing them with one another, contrasting them with their means and consequences, and also with the whole satisfaction, namely happiness, right? There's the formal universal material, and in an external way purifies it of its crudity and barbarism. This repulsion of the universality of thought is the absolute worth of civilization. Well, here's the thing we're talking about here, happiness. So you prioritize things in order to come up with a model of happiness. But here's the insight. Happiness is not the aim of the will. It's not the supreme aim. It's an aim of the will. Happiness is not the supreme aim of the will. Can't be. That means the will would sacrifice perfection for the sake of something outside of itself, some pattern of satisfaction. Okay. I got another weird sound. Someone join me here? Is this me? Let's wait those pinging sounds. Let's move forward. The truth is formal universality, which taken by itself is undetermined and finds definite character in externally given material, is the self-directing universality, which is will or freedom. Since will has as its object, content, and end universality itself, thus assumes the form of the infinite return to self, and wants to assume a universal form where it has united with universal values, universal and objective values, and rights and duties. It is free not only in itself or implicitly, but for itself or explicitly. So in this paragraph is very important. In this paragraph, despite the difficulty of the language, the will is positing itself as its own aim and end. Okay? Will's arrived. So the will which exists absolutely is truly infinite. It generally returns to itself in a way that forms a satisfying system, not arbitrarily through caprice, arbitrary impulse, but through a system of values, rights, and duties. Okay? Now, those values, rights, and duties are only to be discovered within objective institutions. So we have to get to a kind of political philosophy in order to solve the problems of ethics. So when it achieves that full ethical maturity within that that set of institutions, then it returns to itself in a true way, in a way that unites form and content, we said, right? Because its object being the will itself is for it not another or limitation. It's not another thing. Like the will, when the will relates to itself, it's not confronting something external to itself. It's not limited by itself. It returns to itself. It's infinite in that sense, right? You get that? But that's what you want. That's good. And the object of the will has simply reverted into itself. Moreover, it does not mere possibility, capacity, ideality, but infinite actuality. Because the reality of the conception of its visible externality is internal to itself. I'm turning to a long discussion here. Okay. Only in this freedom is the will wholly by itself, because it refers to nothing but itself. All dependence upon any other thing falls away. Will is true, or rather truth itself. Because its character consists in its being and its manifested reality or correlative opposite, what it is in its conception. In other words, the pure conception has the perception or intuition of it as its end in reality. Okay. So the will has grasped itself as its aim and end. That's the universe. The will is willing is universally valid. Everyone should will the same thing, because all limitation of particular individuality are superseded. These one-sided phases are found only in the differences between the conception and its object content, or from another standpoint, the difference between conscious independent existence of the subject and the will's implicit or self-involved existence, or between its including individuality and its universality. We've gotten past all these one-sided phases. You've integrated your values, your rights, and your duties into a coherent system that can only happen at a level of ethical life. He hasn't said that yet, but that'll come out later. All right. So I think I'm going to pause. I think if I'm not mistaken, I've been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes, and I can do another jaunt tomorrow. We'll pick up with 25. All right? Let's see.